So something that's top of mind for me right now is the school situation. I have a 6-year-old son. He'll be going into second grade come September here in New York. And the big question is, are schools going to be open or are they not? And it's become a very divisive issue, as most have. It's become very political. There's lots of different views on it. So I thought I'd show my work a little bit and talk about how I'm trying to think about, what's the right decision for us and our family. And the first step in this is kind of recognizing, I guess my bias is how I would call it, right? My bias is I want my son to go back to school. I want things to go back to normal. I want him to get back to getting the proper education he should be having. I want his teacher to be the one doing the educating rather than me, also working from home. And I want things to go back to normal. I think it's better for him. I think socially, academically, mental health wise, I think it is objectively better if the choice is he's either back at school or he's homeschooled, remote learning. It's objectively true that he goes back to school. I believe that's better. But I say it's a bias because there's motivations in that for me. It's easier for me. It's better. It's more natural. It's more normal. All those reasons pull me towards that direction. So the first thing I have to recognize is those biases and accept them for what they are and acknowledge them, and understand that it's an input, right? It's not that you dismiss your biases necessarily. You just have to understand them and take control of them rather than letting them control you. So in this case, the fact that I want my son to go back to school, I want school to be back open, I want him to be there safely, I want these things to be true, doesn't mean they will be true. It doesn't mean that is the answer. Just because I want it to happen doesn't mean it should happen. So that's a first step, and that's honestly a very first step. A very difficult step for many people. You could substitute any other decision or problem, but that recognizing of the thing that I want, if all else were equal, it doesn't mean just because I want it, that's what it should be. And for many people in many cases, that's what it becomes. It becomes this, but this is what I want, so I'm gonna defend it. I'm gonna advocate for it. I'm gonna justify it. You have to separate. You have to detach, as we always talk about. You can't let your biases, your emotions run rampant. You can't let that be the thing that makes the decision for you. You need logic. You need rational thinking. You need to look at all the inputs. You need to run the math equation, looking at everything. It can't be halfway. So that's kind of the first piece of it, is recognizing what I seemingly want is not, doesn't make it true that should be what it is. And it kind of gets a little bit to identifying your objective, right? If my objective is just to follow my base emotion, to follow my instinct, to do the thing that's easiest, to do the thing that all else equal is best, then okay, that's my objective, but it's more complicated than that. In this case, there's a degree of safety that you have to consider as part of the objective, which would get me to my second point, which is just because it's possible that schools shouldn't open, doesn't mean that they definitely shouldn't open, right? And I think that's the second or sometimes other mistake some folks are making, right? So some people are saying, well, I want schools to be open, therefore open them. I don't care what the science or the data or anything else says, just open them. There's other people, myself being one of them, because this is a personal thing, right? I go from that to recognizing, okay, that's not right. It's possible the school shouldn't be open. There's a risk there, right? So then you could jump to the other extreme and say, well, okay, then they shouldn't be open. It's too dangerous, shut them down. You can't go there either, right? Science, data, logic, analysis, that stuff matters, right? It should be a calculation looking at all of it and understanding what makes the most sense. Just because there is risk, just because there is or are valid reasons for why the school should not be open, doesn't make it simple. Doesn't make it, well, then we don't open them. And I see that far too much, from people, but again, from myself, of as soon as that risk is introduced, and in this case, it's a pretty significant risk potentially, starting to talk about death, it becomes a situation of, well, maybe they should be closed, then definitely close them. If there's any risk in this, you close them down immediately. And you can't think that way, right? Just because it's possible the school shouldn't be open doesn't mean they definitely shouldn't be open. That gets me to my third point. I started to touch on it. This death topic, right? This fear of death. I don't mean to diminish it or dismiss it in any way. Death is arguably the worst thing that could happen in the world. So I don't take it lightly, and it shouldn't be taken lightly, right? When that analysis is happening that I talked about in point 2, the science, the data, the analysis, death needs to be an extremely important component of that analysis. It needs to be weighted appropriately. But it doesn't override the logic. It doesn't override the analysis. Just because risk of death is involved for whoever it is involved, the children, the teachers, the family members when they get home, whatever it is, just because there's a chance of that doesn't mean you throw everything else out the window. The fear of death, much like I said in point 1, where emotions can't run rampant, and just because I want school to open, that can't be the answer. Just because I'm afraid of death, just because I fear that, doesn't mean that emotion can run rampant either and dictate and say, well, again, definitely close it down. And this is what you see often as well. People feeling like, hey, somebody could get sick and die. Shut it down. And it's obvious, right? It's cliched at this point. It's not something new, but you have to be consistent. That's the point of thinking about things in this analytical, logical way, breaking it down, dissecting it. It's so easy to veer off and become inconsistent in how you apply it, right? And it could be any not silly, but any example that you've heard before. People love to bring up the flu. People love to bring up car accidents. People love to bring up flying. People love to bring up overdose on drugs. Like, you can name a number of different things, right? There's risk in death in almost everything we do. You get on a plane, you get in a car, you go to school pre-coronavirus, you take prescription medication. All of these things have a chance of death associated with them. Now, what I would argue is, if you really want to approach this in an analytical, logical way, you start running the true math and you start calculating what is the actual risk as best you can and use that to determine. That's probably the best approach. What is definitely not a good approach is to say, death, did I hear death? Shut it down. Particularly if you don't do that in those other situations. If you're somebody that drives in a car or rides in a plane or whatever it might be, takes prescription medication, it doesn't mean that because you do that, then the school should definitely open, or you shouldn't be afraid of death at all when it comes to the coronavirus. What it means is you have to ensure that you're applying a consistent framework. Are you looking at this thing the same way? Or are you letting biases? Are you letting emotions? Are you letting fear? Are you letting inputs that you're taking from the external, politicians, media, social media? Are you letting them dictate your decision making rather than logic? And if you start to see inconsistencies, if you can't reconcile those things, well, that's an issue that you want to address. So again, it's not simple. There's not an easy answer here. It's personal for each individual person. Their calculation is run on a number of different things: family situation, health issues that might exist, the nature of the schooling that's going to happen, how many kids are at the school. There's a whole bunch of different things to consider. But for me, that's the framework I'm trying to use to run through it, right? Step 1, just because I want the school to be open, I want my son back at school, doesn't mean it should be. Step 2, following that, just because there's a chance or a possibility it shouldn't be open, doesn't mean it definitely shouldn't be. And step 3, if death is the thing that's driving this, if fear of death, because there's a chance of death, if that's shutting it all down, well, that's not the right logical approach. All reasonable people agree death is horrible, but it has to be consistent. You have to evaluate it in a consistent way. It will be unique for this situation. So it's not the same inputs, it's not the same weighting, but the framework, the math you use is always the same math to assess it. The inputs are different, the math has got to be the same. And I think that's the logic, that's the approach that you want to try and follow, even in a situation like this, where it's so seemingly controversial now. It's so emotionally charged. It's so personal in so many ways. You need to find a way to detach and think through, where are the places my mind is running to extremes? Where are the places where my mind's letting emotion take over and not logic? And trying to account for those. And the first step is just seeing them, owning them, for me at least, right? If I don't acknowledge these things of where my mind's doing that, if I can't see them, then I can't combat them. So for me, this helps me do that.